Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Juhi Madaree. Today I will share my lived experience navigating corporate workplaces in South Africa and the United Kingdom with misophonia, hyperacusis, and unknowingly at the time, ADHD, the co-occurrence of ADHD and autism. I'll be sharing parts of that journey, such as the pain of working in environments that disabled me, the coping mechanisms that kept me afloat, and some practical ways organizations can move from superficial inclusion to actualized, human-centered inclusion. I used an autoethnographic approach, drawing on my own narratives, journaling, observation, and reflections across several roles, teams, and organizations. By placing my brain and body at the center of the story, I aim to illuminate how organizational structures, cultures, and policies interact with auditory sensitivities and ADHD, and what that reveals about disability inclusion in the workplace. My auditory sensitivities have been with me since childhood, but I was only formally diagnosed with misophonia and hyperacusis in my mid-20s, and with ADHD at the age of 31. According to various academic papers, misophonia is a disorder of decreased tolerance to specific, often repetitive sounds, primarily human-generated sounds like chewing or breathing or associated stimuli, where the individual's reaction is driven by by the sound's pattern or meaning. These triggers evoke strong emotional, negative emotional and physiological reactions such as anger, irritation, or even disgust. Hyperacusis is characterized by a decreased sound tolerance or oversensitivity to sound, typically triggered by ordinary environmental sounds, which otherwise are tolerable to the normal listener, resulting in pronounced negative reactions that manifest as excessive loudness, annoyance, fear, or pain. ADHD refers to the co-occurrence of two neurodevelopmental disorders, ADHD and autism, which result in a unique blend of symptoms underpinned by cognitive processing differences, resulting in executive functioning challenges, sensory sensitivities, rejection sensitivity, emotional dysregulation, amongst others. And through the social model of disability, I now understand that I'm not the problem. Rather, I become disabled when environments, attitudes, and systems do not accommodate how my brain and senses work. In quiet, calm spaces where my work style is respected and I'm engaged in stimulating passion-fueled tasks, I'm focused, productive, and motivated. But in many work cases, this was rarely the instance. For as long as I can remember, noise has been painful. Open plan offices meant daily exposure to sounds my nervous system read as threats. Crunching, chewing, slurping, pen clicking, mouse clicking, loud typing, pinging, beeping, doors creaking, earphones leaking music, dishes clattering, and colleagues having meetings at their desks. Each intrusive sound triggered or tightened my chest, shortened my breath, and pulled my attention away from my work. Fight or flight surged, but there was nowhere to go. Meeting rooms were often full. and working from home was tightly controlled. And so I would sit at my allocated desk and suffer in silence. I stayed silent because at that point in time, I did believe I was the problem. Too sensitive, too fussy, intolerant. I feared being seen as difficult, dramatic, weak, or crying wolf, and I dreaded conflict. To many, these sounds were trivial, but to me, they were overwhelming and disabling. At one point, I persuaded my psychiatrist to write a letter recommending accommodations. He handed it to me with a warning. Using it might harm my career because of the stigma attached. Suffice it to say, I never gave that letter to HR. A few months later, my immune system crashed and I burnt out. Masking became my default coping strategy. I used earbuds, noise-cancelling headsets that still didn't filter out all the noise, hunted for empty meeting rooms and quiet corners, worked overtime to catch up after losing focus, and tried to appear fine, even when my body was in survival mode. I asked many clarifying questions to manage ambiguity. I wrote down and recorded everything so I wouldn't forget, and quietly bent the rules by moving desks or working from home more than officially allowed, just to stay regulated enough to function. Despite these efforts, I was often misunderstood. Some managers saw me as defiant when I challenged inefficient processes or pushed back on unreasonable workloads, emotional, rash, stubborn, and one even referred to me as a loose cannon. Colleagues just told me to ignore or block out the noise. HR implied that if they accommodated me, they would have to do the same for everyone, subtly treating misophonia and hyperacusis as preferences rather than recognized workplace disabilities. Later, in the UK, I was sent for an occupational health assessment, and my auditory sensitivities were not deemed significant enough to justify working from home more often. I left that process feeling disorientated and painfully aware of how my conditions were being marginalized. The toll on my health was cumulative. Over the years, I experienced severe anxiety, hair loss, gut issues, back pain, pockets of depression, and frequent burnout. My self-esteem eroded. I internalized the idea that I was useless, incompetent, and a failure. My nervous system stayed in a state of hyper-alertness, bracing for the next noise or disturbance. My brain would periodically shut down into paralysis and brain fog. I would muster everything just to make it through the workday and afterward just collapse. When I was in the UK, I began a new role that pushed my executive functioning to its limits. My usual coping mechanisms for planning, organization, and time management fell apart. I struggled with monotonous tasks, shifting priorities, constant interruptions, and being forced into the office when working from home was entirely feasible. Eventually, my brain stopped cooperating with the system's expectations. I could no longer pretend that everything was fine. I resigned from a role at a luxury conglomerate that I had spent years striving towards and returned to South Africa, knowing I needed a different path. Receiving my ADHD diagnosis was a profound turning point. Suddenly, my life and my workplace struggles made sense to me. I realized I was not stupid or slow. My brain processes information differently, and my sensory system is wired more intensely. I was expected to function in workplaces designed around the narrow idea of the normal brain. My sensitivities and reactions were adverse physiological responses to an environment that failed to accommodate my differences. That realization became the catalyst for this research, advocating systemic, not just individual change, and pursuing a career assessing individual workplace needs and facilitating leadership and neurodiversity awareness trainings. Reflecting on my experiences, I saw certain reoccurring barriers beyond structural and physical barriers. Psychologically unsafe cultures prevailed, underpinned by a rigid one-brain-fits-all expectation. Rigid HR rules and policies that paid lip service to well-being rewarded those who met constant demands for ever-expanding workloads, interpersonal communication, and artificial urgency. Mental health webinars and engagement surveys existed, but they did not translate into everyday practices that protected neurodivergent staff. Leadership training was introduced and briefly lifted the quality of management, but as workloads increased and time passed, managers slipped back into harmful habits. The lack of knowledge sharing, rooted in outdated beliefs that new employees must suffer to build resilience, just as their managers did. This rite of passage mentality discouraged proactive documentation and handover systems, forcing constant wheel reinvention and unnecessary cognitive overload. Without simple onboarding housekeeping like pre-setting all resources, trainees and trainers wasted energy on basics instead of higher value work. But beyond this, I questioned the root cause of my exclusion and distress. Many auditory triggers will not stem from human need, but from preferences. Chewing gum, eating at desks. What if systemic inclusion required us to reevaluate the difference between employee preference and need? When preferences constantly override someone else's basic ability to function, they become barriers to actualized inclusion. And a minority's needs are no less valid. The workplace system is made up of interrelated parts that work together toward a common purpose. In the context of the study, I define those parts as structural, managerial, and HR, and cultural, and based on my lived experience, reflected on how these parts can work together to achieve systemic inclusion. Structural recommendations include designing, furnishing, and maintaining a workspace that is sensory friendly. This includes designated quiet zones or rooms, enclosed kitchens, opting for silent analog or digital clocks, and non-clicking pens. Where budget allows, investing in sound-absorbing furniture, for example, and even maintaining basic housekeeping such as regularly oiled hinges. But if it's not feasible or too expensive to make certain changes, then simply allow the individual to choose where they want to sit. I understand that management wants to keep teams and departments together, but seating an individual in a high traffic and loud area could be overwhelming and distracting. In one of my roles, my manager seated me next to the sales department, where the sales team was constantly on their phone. I only lasted there a day before I moved. Management and HR act as the gatekeepers of employee well-being and shaping a neuro-inclusive culture, and I encourage to attend mandatory neurodiversity awareness trainings. They should be held accountable to treat neuro-inclusion as a strategic priority because without their visible commitment, it is unlikely to actualize. They're encouraged to lead mindfully and emphasize safety, not pressure, to optimize engagement. Communication should be devoid of ambiguity, expectation should be clear, timeline should be realistic. And when someone is struggling, replace assumptions with curiosity. Ask, what's getting in the way, not what's wrong with you. Work with an individual's strength and area of interest. When management decided to shift a significant focus of my role toward tedious, routine tasks, I lost all enthusiasm, motivation, and shortly resigned. Cultural recommendations include fostering one where quiet is respected as a legitimate working condition. Normalizing different working styles and rhythms by openly acknowledging neurodiversity as part of human variation. These ideas are not revolutionary. Many are small and seem obvious, but small oversights accumulate, and for someone like me, they can be the difference between sustainable performance and total burnout. In conclusion, my story is only one case, but reflects patterns that many neurodiverse people quietly endure. We underestimate how profound environment, culture, and policies shape whether a brain is enabled or disabled at work. Ultimately, systemic inclusion is not about fixing people or forcing them to conform to a way of being that is inherently different. It's about reshaping environments so all types of brain belong. My invitation to organizations is this: move beyond surface level changes that temporarily and superficially treat symptoms towards systemic change. I implore organizations to adopt a human-centered, neuro-inclusive approach as a strategic imperative. We are all interconnected, and our actions have a ripple effect on each other. Through mindful thinking and action, we can create a more harmonious, regulated system that doesn't just support a segment of the population, but the collective. Thank you.